So if Bigfoot really exists, you think one of those cameras would have documented the creature by now. Well, maybe one did. Watch this.
From the sighting of a strange creature lurking from behind the trees in North Carolina to the frightening sounds that ripped through the air in Illinois, here are 4 shocking encounters that were caught on camera. For many years now, we have had to deal with the nagging concept that there is this giant, hairy bipedal creature out there known as Bigfoot. Alas, till this day, even with the level of technology that has been produced by the greatest minds of our time, we have not been able to conclude that this fabled creature is truly out there. All we have to contend with till date are somewhat unsubstantiated tales of encounters with this creature, or the blurry images and recordings that were supposedly taken of it when these people ran into it in the wild. As such, you can see why many people are not necessarily buying into the notion that Bigfoot exists and is out there wandering through the many woods and forests of North America. Regardless of this skepticism towards the existence of Bigfoot, many people have dedicated their lives to proving that Bigfoot is really out there. As such, many of the Bigfoot enthusiasts that may be out there have gobbled up any evidence that they could find, hoping that each new sample may be the one that will prove that Bigfoot is indeed real. North Carolina Bigfoot sighting. Let's start off with the account of this witness in North Carolina.
Well, there's no conclusive proof Bigfoot exists. When some new evidence pops up, you can bet we're going to check it out.
Back in 2019, a North Carolina native known as Doug Teague was just taking a pleasant stroll with his pet pooch Daisy in the woods close to his home. It seemed like a beautiful enough day. The sun was out and the woods seemed to be greener than ever. Well, the woods would prove to be a bit more special on this day, because this is when he would experience an event that was definitely worth recording. When Doug and Daisy got to a certain point in said woods close to his home, he couldn't help but notice that there was this strange presence lurking within the trees close by. Startled yet fascinated, Doug popped his phone out, hoping to record this strange oddity that was hiding behind the tall trees close by. Later on, Doug would recall that the object was almost pitch black, with something of a silver sheen to it. At first glance, Doug, who just happened to be a Bigfoot enthusiast, seemed to think that he was in the presence of something else. Despite his leanings towards the existence of this creature, Doug initially believed that he may have come across a massive gorilla. How on earth could that be? Gorillas are not native to the North Carolina woods, so it was highly implausible for one to be wandering around before Doug ran into it. Having overcome his initial shock, Doug realized how blurry his footage was, so he decided to get a better recording of it.
Looks like it's looking over top of that stump. Look at it. He's moving.
Zooming closer to get a better peek of what was before him, Doug hoped this would improve the footage, but all we got was a better outline of what may have been hiding behind these trees in the woods. This was when he realized that the creature was much more active initially, as it was making some knocking sounds. Moments later, though, Doug was forced to snap out of his fascinated trance when a rock came hurling towards him and Daisy. Once he was out of this trance, his mind fell to the fact that sightings of such ape-like creatures in the area seemed to go as far back as the 1800s. Maybe that is why he had the wherewithal to obtain some casts of the creature's footprint once the coast was clear. This takes us to Cliff Barackman, an individual who runs the North American Bigfoot Center. Excited by the castings of the footprints that Doug had come up with, he could not help but compare them to the ones that he considered to be credible in his archives. This added more credence to Doug's encounter because Cliff considered them to be believable, especially when compared to the features that he spotted on his own Bigfoot footprint castings. As credible as this may seem to the likes of Cliff, we still have to be wary about what Doug produced because there is this long history of people who have come up with fake castings in such situations. Pretty annoying, but we can only say that is the nature of the game. As such, experts such as Kathy Strain, a highly respected anthropologist, after taking a look at Doug's castings, felt compelled to believe that what she was looking at was the real deal. The evenness of the toes told her that this must belong to the giant humanoid creature known as Bigfoot. Add the 15-inch size of the footprints casting, Kathy was certain that Doug's encounter in the woods was no hoax. He must have run into Bigfoot while he was out there. That said, others such as Lucy Eckersley were more concerned about some of the other features apart from the size of said footprint.
Dogs have an extraordinary sense of smell, so if this was something brand new, maybe something like a Sasquatch that had a totally different smell to a human.
She was more concerned about the distance between the footprints, and looking at how far apart they were, she was certain that they must have belonged to something that must have been 15 feet long. Despite this, she told us to focus on the fact that Daisy was not going crazy by the sight of the supposed Bigfoot. After all, dogs are quite sensitive to such things, and as such, we should have heard some erratic barking from Daisy. Alas, all we hear is Doug's voice in the footage. With that in mind, we are forced to consider the notion of whether or not this was a bear. As bears are not known to throw rocks, however, we are also forced to consider the thought that this was just a failed hoax. Outrageous, but not too unusual when it comes to the search for Bigfoot. It is annoying because all this does is create another setback for those who are trying to prove that Bigfoot is real. California Bigfoot sighting. Another interesting encounter that must be considered as we try to assert the veracity of the existence of this creature is the one that occurred over in California back in 1971. It all happened when a pair of friends known as Al Berry and Ron Moorhead decided to take a trip to the Sierra Nevada mountains. Apparently, they decided to take such a trip because they wanted to carry out an investigation on some mysterious noises that were reported by a shaken-up group of hunters who were out there some time ago. With their handy microphones, Al and Ron were able to record the first of a series of recordings that have since been referred to as the Sierra Sounds. Sounds like an Arctic monkey track, but is far more sinister than anything that the band could ever produce. This is because upon listening to said recordings, we found that they sounded like a series of guttural howls and growls that would be enough to make your skin crawl. Turns out that said sounds could actually be attributed to the legendary Bigfoot because they have been known to make such sounds, at least according to those who may have run into such a creature in the past. Going further to ascertain what he may be experiencing out there, Ron claimed that he would go as far as having some sort of interaction with the mysterious creatures that were responsible for such sounds. As we listen, we can hear how the different parties attempted to interact by making use of a series of hoots and howls. What is even more interesting about such an interaction is that they seem to be authenticated by Cliff Barackman, a field researcher who has acknowledged the Sierra Sounds as being the gold standard for Bigfoot vocalization. This wasn't just some sort of empty claim. Cliff states that he came to such a conclusion because of the interactions that he had with a good number of witnesses in the past. Said witnesses claimed that these guttural growls and wild hoots occurred when they came across Bigfoot, and as such, we have to take what Al and Ron recorded seriously. The issue with such sounds, some of which may even come across as incomprehensible chatterings, is that they are difficult to authenticate. Why? Well, because any human could not only imitate them, but create them for their own agenda. As such, the only thing that can be done is to leave such samples with their expert analysts. They will be the ones to tell us if these sounds are real or not. Cue in Roxy Furman, an expert zoologist who was keen to lend her expertise to the matter. First thing she did was to state that there are no known primates that call California home. That said, she had to acknowledge that whatever was responsible for such sounds must have been huge in stature. This is because the sound was loud but seemed to be low in pitch and frequency. As such, she was sure that these sounds must have come from a large animal, maybe something that was as large as the legendary Bigfoot.
The sound is really loud and it's of quite a low pitch and frequency, so it travels far. So it's likely that it came from a large animal.
Following this, the samples were taken to a soundscape ecologist known as Dr. Ben Gottesman. Upon listening to the sample, Dr. Ben analyzed the growls, whoopings, and chatters and came to the conclusion that they seemed to sound quite similar to words. With that in mind, he went on to compare the sounds to those which were made by some large animals, such as elk bugling and bear growlings. Although there were some similarities, he had to dismiss the notion that it was made by such creatures. Following this, he went on to claim that whatever was responsible for such sounds must have had a huge vocal range. That said, he just couldn't attribute the sounds to any animal that could be found in the region. This forces us to consider the fact that such noises may have been made by none other than human beings. Do we smell another hoax? Well, certain experts have dismissed the notion that the sounds were made by human beings. Kathy Strain, our anthropologist, was forced to come to this conclusion because she realized that the wave variants seemed to be too far apart, because the creature could go from a very high pitch to a very low growl within what seemed to be seconds. Humans are just not capable of doing this, at least not at the cost of ruining their vocal cords. As such, Kathy was compelled to believe that there is every chance that these noises were indeed made by the real deal. Maybe she is right. Maybe the Sierra sounds were created by the legendary Bigfoot. Who knows? Another Bigfoot sighting in California. Let's take our attention to another Bigfoot sighting that is said to have occurred in California. This encounter was experienced in the 21st century as a hiker claimed he ran into the legendary creature when he went out to explore the San Gabriel Mountains back in 2020.
There's a figure right here, and it definitely appears to be a hominid shape. You see a head, what appear to be shoulders, and 2 arms, and possibly even 2 legs.
Having gotten to something of a vantage point within the aforementioned San Gabriel mountain range, our hiker could not help but record and zoom into something that was one of the nearby evergreens. This just happened to be the presence of someone or something that happened to be looking right back at our hiker. Truly creepy stuff. Later on, analysts would take a look at the figure that was staring at our hiker from a distance. They just couldn't help but notice that it did resemble a hominid such as Bigfoot, and as such, they were compelled to take it seriously. This is interesting because many of the Bigfoot sightings that have been recorded to take place in California took place in the northern region of the state rather than the south. However, it was not too unusual for such a sighting to occur in the south of California. After all, it has been noted that the mountains in Southern California are quite remote. Aside from that, they are also notoriously rugged, and as such, it would be the perfect kind of place for creatures such as Bigfoot to make home, as it would be great to keep humans away. Such an idea is given some credence thanks to the fact that some witnesses reported that they came across the massive hominid in the San Bernardino Mountains, which are also within the region of Southern California. Further credence is added to the fact that Cliff Barackman, our field researcher, has come across several reports which detailed how several Bigfoots or Sasquatches had been spotted climbing up and jumping off the trees that are in the area. This is credible because although humans can climb trees, they just cannot do it as well as Bigfoot. We just don't have the powerful arms and legs that these creatures have, so we cannot compare our ability to climb and jump off trees to theirs. With that in mind, though, we have to look at the science of the situation. Bigfoot is said to be a large creature, so much so that some believe that they can weigh as much as 800 pounds. With that in mind, could they actually be nimble enough to climb trees, as our witnesses have claimed?
There are a small number of credible reports of rather large Sasquatches being up in trees or having been seen jumping down from trees.
Will they be able to do so without breaking the branches off the trees that they are climbing? Let's see what certain experts have to say about such a concept. When we asked Dr. Jeff Meldrum, a respected professor of anatomy and anthropology, he claimed that he could not see any resources up such trees that could attract humans to climb so high. With that in mind, he was compelled to turn his attention to any of the omnivorous primates that may thrive in such a region. Considering that we are talking about the forests that can be found in the temperate northern hemisphere, Dr. Meldrum figured that most of the carbs and sugars that can be found in such an area are located underground because they can be found in the roots and tubers there. As such, whatever creature that may be climbing up those trees would have to be on the smaller side. As such, he could not see these massive, supposedly 800-pound creatures climbing up such trees. Think about it this way. When bears are still cubs, sure they can climb up these trees with ease, especially if they are trying to avoid danger. However, when these bears mature into adulthood, we just cannot see these bears climbing up these trees so well. The same probably goes for huge creatures such as Bigfoot. Such an assessment of the situation was seen as correct by our zoologist, Roxy Furman. She was of the belief that our hiker must have come across a much smaller creature that could not be Bigfoot at all. Indeed, she was of the opinion that our hiker must have run into a chimpanzee or something similar. Alas, as chimpanzees are not native to the region of Southern California, we may have to consider that our hiker actually ran into Mo, the chimpanzee. Having gained some form of notoriety after it escaped from its home back in 2008, it is interesting that it had not been seen since it gained its liberation from captivity.
The animal that it looks most similar to is the chimpanzee.
Even then, at the time Mo escaped, it was believed to be in its 40s, so for it to be alive and nimble enough to climb trees in 2020 is highly impossible, as it would have met its demise by then. With that in mind, we are forced to believe that whatever was seen may not have even been animated. It always seems to be a bit still, with features that were thicker than it ought to have been. As such, there is every chance that our hiker ran into an optical illusion of some sort. That said, there is every chance that our hiker may have run into a younger version of the legendary hominid. For now, we have to take this account with a pinch of salt. Maybe our hiker ran into an unidentified animal at the end of the day. North Illinois Bigfoot sighting. Finally, we head over to the state of Illinois, where a local horticulturist was just taking part in what he considered to be a routine mushroom hunt. As this was back in 2015, it wasn't too unusual for him to want to film himself as he took part in his activities. What would prove to be unusual is what he would record in the process of his mushroom picking. Soon, he came across what he could only consider to be a half-eaten mushroom. As odd as that was, things would get even odder in just a matter of moments. The humorous moment would take a sinister turn when the local horticulturist was startled to attention by this strange and scary sound that ripped into the silence of the woods. Loud and ragged, we cannot blame our horticulturist for frantically panning around with his camera as he hoped to get to the source of this frightening sound. Alas, this would prove to be a wasted effort because he would never come across anything out there. In fact, considering how scary the situation was, we also cannot blame our horticulturist for calling it a wrap, as the scared man packed his things so that he can go back home.
I
think it's time to go.
Thankfully, he had recorded enough for Ken Gerhardt, a field researcher, to analyze and deduce if these sounds were indeed made by our legendary cryptid. A well-known Bigfoot enthusiast himself, Gerhardt is also of the belief that Bigfoot is indeed a real primate that is capable of producing a wide variety of noises that is similar to that of other primates, maybe even human beings. As such, once he analyzed the noises, Gerhardt classified them as yells or screams that could be made by the legendary cryptid. After all, Bigfoot is believed to be something of a social creature, and as such, they must be able to communicate with one another, especially if they are within proximity of each other. As interesting as such a notion may be, Gerhardt took things further by claiming that what we heard was not a mating call. Instead, he was convinced that this was a war cry. Fascinating stuff. How was he able to deduce that? Well, we can agree that we can all hear a certain level of aggressiveness in these calls. As such, we can come to the conclusion that whoever or whatever was making these sounds was trying to scare someone out of the area. Aside from this, Gerhardt points us back to the evidence of the half-eaten mushrooms. Known to be what is called an opportunistic omnivore, Gerhardt believes that there is every chance that Bigfoot did take a good chunk out of those mushrooms that our horticulturist ran into. With that in mind, we must turn our attention to the fact that when it comes to Bigfoot sightings in the state of Illinois, they always seem to occur in the south, especially in places such as the Shawnee National Forest. As such, it is sort of unusual that our horticulturist ran into this creature or whatever was responsible for those scary sounds in the south of Illinois. This could be explained away by the fact that Bigfoot is believed to be something of a nomadic creature.
Most animals vocalize for a couple of primary reasons. One is for mating.
That said, we consulted with Kathy Strain to see if these sounds could have been made by some of the creatures that could be in the area. First, we considered if the noise could have been made by black bears, as these creatures could have creeped in from neighboring Missouri and Wisconsin. Upon listening to the sound, Kathy Strain noted that bears do growl, but they don't tend to scream like that. Coyotes and foxes were also ruled out, so we were forced to consider whether or not the sound was made by humans. Said analysis ruled out that it could have been made by humans. In fact, when compared to dinosaurs of all things, Dr. Ben Gottesman, our resident soundscape ecologist, found a match. This tells us that this must have been a hoax. That said, this does not mean that Bigfoot isn't out there. If anything, this just means that we just have to keep on searching for the truth. With any luck, one day we may actually be able to prove that Bigfoot is real. From the sighting of a strange creature lurking from behind the trees in North Carolina to the frightening sounds that ripped through the air in Illinois, here are 4 shocking encounters that were caught on camera.